In this recording, I'm going to talk a little bit about this sunflower painting and the process I used to create it. It's actually one of the few paintings that I use quite a bit of opaque watercolor with. And opaque watercolor, you'll remember, is something that I do not want my students to use much at all during their first semester of painting. There may be a few exceptions to that. So on this painting, the sunflower, the major leaves and stem of the sunflower, these large leaves over here on the left are these large, long, slender leaves and stem, and maybe just a few other major stems were painted with Misket, protecting that area of the paper. Having done that, and when the Misket dried, I was able to then go in and do quite a bit of this background that you see, this wet on wet background. However, I'll talk a little bit later about how I accomplished the darker parts of the background. So once I had Misket protecting, by the way, Misket is just a brand name for a mascoid, a water-soluble material that you paint onto the surface, let it dry, and it protects the paper from the paint. So once that Misket was applied and dry, it's critical that it be completely dry, I was able to do this wet on wet background. Once that background dried completely, I was able to rub the Misket off and then go in to these white areas of the sunflower and these leaves and paint in the detail, which is just a series of graded and flat washes. Pretty straightforward, basic technique for watercolor. So after those were painted, they looked pretty decent on this wet on wet background. The problem was it was just really boring, and I needed to figure out some way to give the painting some visual depth, some life. So I went back in and painted some other areas. This dark purple, wet on wet, this band of dry brush, and other similar areas were painted on after the sunflower was painted, which meant that I had to moisten an area bigger than where the water was going to flow to, and then put in this deep purple and let it run wet on wet. The water, when I painted it in, was only on the area where I wanted this dark purple to go, which meant it created sort of a dam effect where the water, the wet on wet, would flow right up to the edge of this sunflower and the leaf, but not go back on it because this was dry and this was wet. So I did that with this section, and then this section, and then this section, well, this one and then this one. So I was able to create this look as if this whole thing was put on with one wet on wet brush stroke. It wasn't. That was put on a little bit at a time. Then with the paper dry, I did the same thing with this, but on a dry area, not on a wet area. A little tougher right here because I had to moisten the paper real critically right here with hard-edged, and then flow this in and let the water run into the hard-edged blockade was created by the wet paper versus dry paper. Well, that improved it. I then had some really dark areas down here, some stronger color here, some stronger here, but it still just lacked something. So I began layering in with opaque watercolor a myriad of blades of grass, all of these smaller blades of grass that you see. Well, this one was, I think, done initially. this long, tall S-curve. That was done with Miskit. But a lot of these that you see, most of the smaller blades of grass were painted on with opaque watercolor. That's using Chinese white and color to give the Chinese white color. So this, which appears to be a flowing long leaf that goes in front of, behind, in front of, behind, in front of, was actually painted by making this part, then this one, skipping, doing this. It appears that this went all the way across, but then I put a shadow in later here. And then going across, again, this is opaque watercolor going across this stem. Then later, to give a little more sense of depth, a few cast shadows, like the cast shadow of this leaf onto this stem was placed right here. Here's another cast shadow. Here's a cast shadow over here that arcs across the bend in the leaf. So by adding this myriad of details with the grass and then the wet on wet darker background, I was able to give this a complexity that it didn't have before, much more successful now than it was. And I was going to zoom in to show you, but I don't think I can zoom in with this. But down here with my signature, this is actually opaque watercolor, I believe. More often than not, when I do a signature in a dark background, I use clear water and blotting over and over to lift the pigment out. So that's the basic process of creating this sunflower, my Nebraska sunflower, done from a photograph of a single sunflower out on the plains of the panhandle of Nebraska. So I hope I've explained this enough that you could use some of the techniques in your own paintings. Thank you.